Thank you for joining us today for another taping of Climate Matters. My name is Stuart Scott, and we're coming live to you today from the UN Climate Talks in Bonn, Germany. Here's my email address if you'd like to get in touch with questions or comments about the show. And today's topic, flaws in the IPCC process. I have with me today Dr. Salimul Huq, who's director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and he is a chapter lead author on 2 of the IPCC reports that have come out. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Huq.
Thank you.
I know you're very busy here. You did a press conference yesterday. May we start with news of that press conference? Would you tell us about it?
Sure, be happy to do that. It was a press conference of a group of countries that came together a few years ago called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. Its current chair is the Philippines, and they had a press conference yesterday with the minister from the Philippines speaking, as well as the heads of delegations from Costa Rica and Bangladesh, who were previous chairs of the group. And the topic of this particular press conference and this meeting here in Bonn is on the need to reinforce a previously existing insistence on a target of 1.5 degrees.
1.5 degrees.
Exactly.
Not 2 degrees.
Not 2 degrees anymore.
Can you give a very brief thumbnail of why 1.5?
Absolutely. So what has happened here while we've been in Bonn is that we have received a report from something called the Structured Expert Dialogue, which was looking at a review of the temperature target, which has been taking place for the last 2 years.
And that's part of the UN
process.
Part
of the UNFCCC process. It was started a couple of years ago as the review process. We have now had a report from them, which essentially says that 2 degrees is no longer safe for everybody. It's safe for some, but not for others. And the group that was represented here yesterday were the others, who are not protected by 2 degrees.
So
they're asking for 1.5 degrees.
Might I be safe to say that those who are protected under 2 degrees more are the developed, wealthy nations?
The developed, wealthy nations as nations, but rich people more generally everywhere. So it's poor countries and poor people who fall in the category of not being protected by 2 degrees, but would be protected by 1.5 degrees.
Very, very interesting. So we really need to stop talking about 2 degrees and start talking about 1.5 degrees.
We would like that to be the case, exactly, yes.
I've even heard from some people that 1.5 degrees is too much, that we should be talking about 1 degree.
1 degree may be almost impossible. We're at 0.8 degrees already above pre-industrial.
Okay.
And we may well be locked into another 0.5 or 0.6. So about 1.4 degrees is already locked into the system. It can't be reversed. But 1.5 degrees can be achieved. It'll take a monumental effort, but it can be done.
Well, I'd like to have another show or 2 shows on that monumental effort. But today we're wanting to discuss specifically flaws in the IPCC process. And for the people who are less experienced with the climate negotiations, who we hope will be a large part of the audience we have on the internet, IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a group of approximately 2,500 scientists. Some come, some leave the group, but no one is paid as far as I know.
That's right.
It's all volunteers. This is in addition to their work, their paying work at their universities and their research projects. And their task is to come up with a report which is supposed to advise the policymakers about the state of climate on Earth and what we need to do to avoid catastrophic warming. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so IPCC is the acronym. Think scientists, lots of them. Think consensus. There's an overwhelming consensus. It is a consensus document. Now, that does present an issue because that consensus, at some point, as we'll explore later, the nations of Earth, the governments who are supposed to be advised, also influence that consensus. So we'll return to that question. Now, the first question I have for you, Is this IPCC report still fit for the purpose for which it was intended?
I think the IPCC report is still fit for one purpose for which it was intended, which is to provide credible state-of-the-art on the science of climate change. It started off doing that from the first assessment report, and it's continued to do that periodically to the fifth assessment report, which had just come out a few months ago. And I think it does that very, very well. It's authoritative voice of the scientific community. On the other hand, it perhaps is not as up to speed in terms of providing quick advice. It takes a long time to get reports out. So we won't hear, the next report won't come out for another 6 or 7 years, which is a long time to wait.
No, that is interesting, because then late-breaking news, so to speak, new discoveries about the Arctic are not factored in for a long time.
That's what happens. So one of the things that one has to realize about the IPCC report is that the day it gets published and approved, it's already out of date, because it's only citing literature that goes back well over a year before it gets published. It has to go through several review processes in which new literature cannot be introduced.
So there's a year of review for already published scientific papers, and then I'm told those scientific papers take a year or two to research and get published. So there's perhaps a 2 to 3 year lag from when new discoveries can make it into consideration.
That's correct.
Is this a tolerable state of affairs?
I think it is tolerable where there's a slow-moving change. If things don't change for 5 or 10 years, then a 2-year time lag doesn't make a difference. However, the area that I work in, which is Working Group 2, which is on vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation, adaptation is a much faster-moving beast. And policymakers and planners and practitioners now want information on adaptation much quicker. They don't want to wait 6 years, because things are already happening and they're going to have to take decisions on adaptation. So one of the flaws, if you like, in the IPCC is with regard to the time lag involved in producing reports on adaptation, which aren't fast enough for the policymakers. So when it comes to adaptation, policymakers and decision makers would rather have slightly uncertain information faster than wait for certainty and get it when it's too late.
Very interesting distinction. I'd rather know something's coming at me soon, even if there's a chance it'll miss me, rather than wait to be sure it's going to hit me.
Exactly.
That sounds to me to be proven.
And in my area of work in adaptation, increasingly we are getting demands from policymakers for, tell me something, even if it's not exactly the most robust science.
Now, for those of you in our audience on the internet who are less than familiar with the context of the word adaptation, we did a whole show on that yesterday, and you can find it on our playlists on YouTube. But can you just say a word, what is meant by adaptation?
Sure. So one of the, if you like, evolutions of the climate change issue has been how the problem gets framed, and then as a problem is framed, the solutions to that problem assert themselves as well. So the initial years of the IPCC, the problem got framed primarily, if not exclusively, as one in which the problem is the emissions of greenhouse gases that are causing the warming. And therefore, the solution is, let's reduce them or stop them. And in the climate change jargon, we call that mitigation. So you had problem is emissions, solution was mitigation.
Good. That's half of the story now.
That's half of the story. And indeed, the IPCC made a very big contribution in changing that story at the third assessment report of the IPCC, which came out in 2001, which is the first time I was a lead author in the IPCC on the chapter on adaptation, which said, the IPCC report said, that despite promises to reduce emissions, emissions continue to go up. And therefore, there's a certain degree of warming that is now locked into the atmosphere because of the lags of these greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas emission today is not going to warm the atmosphere for another 10 or 20 years. So the next 10 or 20 years worth of warming is already locked in. Even if we reduce emissions to 0 today, it makes no difference for the next 20 years. The next 20 years worth of warming will happen. So we need to deal with that. We're going to have to cope with that. That's going to come with some impacts, adverse impacts, which we now cannot avoid. And so we have a new problem, which is unavoidable impacts in the near term, to which no amount of mitigation will help, but we now have to adapt. We have to prepare ourselves for that.
Okay.
And that's what adaptation means. It's dealing with the inevitable and unavoidable impacts of global warming or human-induced climate change.
Now, if I may, if you think in terms of your newspapers and the news you see of the world, those impacts include crop failures and starvation. And even though in the developed world we have a tendency to think, oh, those are over there, somewhere else, poor countries, I'd like to point out that California now, not exactly a poor country, is experiencing a historic drought. And people say that this drought is not temporary, it will go on. So crop failures in the United States are also an issue. The superstorms we've experienced, they are not only over there in the Philippines, poor country, developing nation, they are also New York City, Hurricane Sandy, Miami, Hurricane Katrina. So these locked-in phenomenon, climate phenomenon, and the adaptation we need to do affect us all.
Absolutely. Nobody escapes the impacts of climate change.
That's what I want to hear. That's what I want the audience to hear.
But there is a sequence. You know, poor countries and poor people get hit first. The rich will get hit maybe tomorrow, but they will get hit, and we're beginning to see that happening as well. If I can also add another point about the difference between a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree world. It may seem trivial, but it does make a huge difference to the magnitude of these events. So even a 0.5 degree warmer ocean temperature will be much more devastating cyclone, typhoon, or hurricane, whichever part of the world you come from and which term you use, than it otherwise would be. And so, you know, you could manage a Category 3, but if it becomes a Category 5, then the amount of damage that it makes is orders of magnitude bigger.
And if I may demonstrate that for our audience or give you an idea, if the distance between my microphone and the loudspeaker is, say, 4 feet, as I go towards that speaker, at some point it will start to scream at you. I think that's what we're talking about.
Exactly. There's a feedback loop.
The feedback loop. And once you hit that feedback loop, then things get out of control very quickly.
That's right. So it's not incremental. It's not that each 0.1 degree is equal to any other 0.1 degree. The critical ones are the 1.5 to 2 degree range for many, many people around the world.
I do think that I see signs that the developed nations of the world, the rich nations, are getting it. They're beginning to, one might say, panic a little bit around the edges.
I think that there is no question about the science amongst leaders around the world, including the United States of America. President Obama gets it. You know, I've seen speeches he's given which are terrific. He knows the science.
Why doesn't America get it then?
Well, there are people in Congress that he can't persuade and who are, in my view, unpersuadable.
And why are they unpersuadable?
Because they've been bought by the oil lobbies.
Oh, now, we did not arrange this ahead of time. Let's not say bought. Let's say influenced.
Okay.
We want to avoid a case of libel or slander. But there is an undue influence exerted by those people who want the business to remain as usual. And that business as usual is threatening us all. And I say that until the bankers and the multinationals realize that they are just as in danger as the rest of us, they won't really try to find a solution. Now, if we can go on, can you discuss with us perhaps some of the shortcomings of the IPCC process and report, having seen it from the inside?
Well, let me describe it first, because people tend to have a somewhat, if you like, misinterpreted view of what the IPCC can and cannot do, or does and does not do. Firstly, it does not do research. It assesses the existing literature. So unless there is already research done on something, the IPCC can't actually report on it. It has to assess. First point. Second point is that the author teams who write the report write it on the basis of the existing literature that they find. The teams themselves arrive at a consensus on the wording of their reports. They are responsible for their individual chapters, and they then write a summary for policymakers. And it is the summary for policymakers that then undergoes a review word by word by governments, because the panel, the I in IPCC does not stand for international, it stands for intergovernmental, which is the governments are the IPCC.
Now, let's hone in on that one a little bit. When you say they review it, do they review it as in understand it, or review it as in say, this we don't want to hear?
They review it as in understanding what the scientists are telling them and trying to understand that and agreeing the language that then is used to inform policymakers.
But do they have the right to eliminate things?
They have the right to emphasize something. So they can't eliminate anything from the underlying report. So think of the summary of policymakers being something that is existing in the underlying chapters that the authors think this is important enough that policymakers should know about it. So I'm going to take this paragraph out of my chapter and put it in the summary for policymakers. Now, that then has to be approved by the government representatives who are at the plenary meeting that approves the final summary for policymakers. They have to make a judgment as to, is this important enough to take to the policymakers? And there can be a consensus at times that this paragraph is not important enough to take it to the policymakers, and therefore it doesn't go in the summary for policymakers. But it doesn't mean they can eliminate it from the chapter itself. It's in the chapter, but it hasn't been elevated to the summary for policymakers.
Okay, that differs than my understanding. So you're an insider, I'm an outsider. So let me pursue that a little bit. If this summary for policymakers comes up and is being read and debated in the plenary, and there's a recommendation by the IPCC that we put a fee on carbon to reduce emissions, is or is it not the right of some nations, say those with great oil reserves, to say, we want that played down, or in some respect?
No, that's an incorrect understanding. So firstly, the IPCC lead authors and the chapters cannot make prescriptive statements. So the IPCC, by its mandate, is supposed to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So what they will say is, if you did this, say a levy on carbon, this is what we find will happen. And it's your decision whether you want to make this a policy decision or not. So the scientists will say the consequences of policy A versus policy B versus policy C, but not make a recommendation on which one to follow. That's a decision that politicians have to make, and that's essentially what the UN Framework Convention is about. They take the science from the IPCC, and then they have to make the decisions on which policy to adopt. So the policy, for example, the IPCC will give a pattern of what the impacts will be from 1.5 degrees to 4 degrees. But they're not going to say which one the governments should adopt. They'll say what the consequences of each one are going to be, and therefore governments have to take the decision on where they want to be on that spectrum.
Now, since you say 4 degrees, they are considering scenarios in which the planet will, on average, heat 4 degrees. And is it safe to say those are catastrophic?
Absolutely. And indeed, unfortunately, they are in the range of where we are headed with business as usual. Even though policymakers have adopted a decision that 2 degrees is the limit they want, on the other hand, they're not doing things that will take us to 2 degrees. They're doing things that still take us well above 3 degrees.
Yes, I've heard perhaps as much as 8 degrees.
The upper end of the fan is around 8 degrees, you're right. And historically, now that we've had well over 20 years of IPCC reports, we now have evidence for the last 20 years where the model runs, the fan of the model runs, the actual temperatures have been at the upper end, not the median.
When you bring in the word model, that actually suggests something else I wanted to discuss with you today. I've been in touch with and interviewed another professor, Dr. Peter Wadhams from Cambridge University, who's head of the Department of Ocean Physics and does expeditionary science to the Arctic ice sheet, has been doing so for 40 years in British nuclear submarines going under the Arctic. And the changes in the Arctic are quite alarming. And in my discussions and interview with him, he has contrasted for me the modeling scientific community and the expeditionary scientific community, and a controversy perhaps where the modelers are what the IPCC report really is based upon, and the modelers tend to reject some of the real data that's being found at in the changes in the Arctic, as you say, late-breaking changes, the methane release, for instance. They say, oh, certain modelers say, oh, that can't be happening. There's no methane up there. And then others say, well, the methane's up there, but it can't be emitted because our models say that it can't be emitted quite yet. Is it correct to say that the IPCC report is in the hands of the modeling scientific community?
Well, I'm not a modeler myself. I'm also not a member of the Working Group 1, which does the modeling and the science of climate change. I'm in Working Group 2, which is looking at impacts. But I'll venture an answer, nevertheless, which is that models are, by nature, imperfect. You can't have a perfect model. And the different models that we have, the global circulation models, which we're talking about, there are about a dozen of them globally, they have different parameters, they have slight differences between them, but they agree a lot. First of all, they agree that temperatures are going to go up. None of them says it's going to go down. They disagree slightly on how much they're going to go up. One of the flaws in the models are that the models take average temperatures, and they can't do catastrophic events, for example. So how many cyclones are there going to be? That's not something models are good at predicting.
Or if there's a huge burst of methane in the Arctic.
Precisely. And so unforeseen actions, like the huge burst of methane, like the Greenland ice sheet just suddenly disappearing, those are things that we are seeing inklings that might happen. So the models cannot predict the unpredictable. Then they tend to take a business as usual idea on what the future might be, but reality trumps models anytime.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned the Greenland ice sheet. Again, to make this relevant for all of those out there listening, the disappearance of the Greenland ice sheet accounts for about how many feet of ocean rise, or how many meters, shall we say?
I think at least a meter, possibly more.
Okay, so we're talking about wet streets in New York, wet streets in Beijing, wet streets in all of the coastal cities, a lot of the infrastructure gone. I remember a figure that I saw once, I used to use it in my own presentations about climate, that 50% of humanity lives within 30 kilometers of the ocean. So we're talking about a huge amount of infrastructure being impacted. And interestingly enough, I'm told that China, who's been ridiculed in the U.S. for building huge cities that are not occupied as a way of keeping their economy inflated, that actually these cities are for moving the populations from Shanghai and Beijing. And I thought that was a very interesting conjecture. Well, moving back to our main subject, the IPCC report, the flaws, perhaps how to fix them. Can you make recommendations? How would you change the process? How would you change perhaps the feedback that where nations are allowed to or have to review this, and any influence that they might unduly exert at that point? How would you fix the process?
Well, I would say that there are many things that the IPCC does well, and particularly the reliance on good scientific literature assessed by experts in the field. Perhaps one of the modifications that can be done is drawing on a wider range of expertise. Traditionally, the expertise that has been drawn in has been heavily northern or from developed countries, and heavily from natural sciences, less so from the developing world and less so from the social sciences. I think now that we are tackling the problem, there's a much bigger role for knowledge to be brought in from a wider spectrum of sources. So scientists from developing countries and more social scientists in general is something that the future of the IPCC needs to think about, making it a more balanced report in itself.
How would you fix the problem that you raised with it being a very slow breaking process, necessarily 1, 2, or 3 years behind the science?
Well, the IPCC does have a mechanism to, in relative terms, fast-track particular issues. They produce periodically, in addition to the big assessment reports every 7 years, they can do special reports. They did a special report recently on extreme events, for example. These are quicker. They take maybe a year or two, not a year, but at least 2 years to do. And they can be on a particular focus topic. They can come out quicker. They can be more policy relevant in real time. And I think more special reports is probably a good thing to think about.
Right away it comes to mind, who can initiate these? Can I go somehow and say, please, you need to do a special report on the methane release going on?
Special reports have to be agreed by, and any government can suggest one, but the plenary, the government plenary bureau that meets, they will make decisions on how many special reports, which topics to do them on.
So this is a point at which any government can say no?
Well, it's a consensus-based process. So
consensus means everybody has to agree.
Yes.
So a particular nation who does not want that, for instance, again, I'm sorry I keep returning to the problem of methane, but I think of that one as the most dangerous part of the whole process that's not factored into the IPCC report. And I'm trying to think, how do we get it in there? As we say, the modelers can't see it happening, so they don't want it in there, and they are more or less in control of the report. So how do we get that introduced? Now, in terms of national interests, there are a lot of nations that really want to go up there and start drilling for oil. You know, show me the money. And money is the thing that's dooming us right now, or our desire for money. So if Russia, for instance, does not mind an ice-free Arctic because it offers all kinds of mineral and oil development, can't they hold up the whole process of having that methane release put into the report?
Well, any process that requires a consensus is theoretically hostage to every single country saying no. So any country can say no and you don't have a consensus.
Does that happen?
In the IPCC, very rarely. It has happened in the UNFCCC.
Okay, so it doesn't happen within meetings of the IPCC, but again, I'm honing in on the policymakers' review. Does it happen there, as far as you know?
There are always differences of opinion. It's rare that one country will hold things up. So what tends to happen in the IPCC review, which is just a review, so they're not making things up. They're agreeing to allow certain language. So it's between the authors and the representatives of the governments. And very often it boils down to the language that is used in a sentence, and it's about the adjective that is used. So is the situation very bad, bad, somewhat bad? And they argue about that a lot. And in the end, they have to come to a consensus on which adjective they should use to describe the magnitude of a problem or the seriousness of a problem.
Okay, but then if you turn down the volume, perhaps, on particular statements, then it allows you to turn down the urgency of action on those statements as well?
Well, turning down the volume on certain statements is what they do. Okay, so you have to have consensus, and consensus is always conservative. Okay, some of us, even in the author teams, we have arguments. Some of us would like to say something stronger, but in the author team, the others don't agree, and we agree to a language that is the minimum everybody can live with. And that's what happens. But you needn't, I don't think, need to invest more significance in the IPCC reports than they deserve. The IPCC isn't the reason why countries do or do not do things. We've got IPCC reports that are very clear about the warnings, and countries are still not taking them seriously. So they're not controlling the science, they're just ignoring the science.
Now that is interesting, and let's, before we go, because our time is almost up, going outside of the IPCC process, going outside of the UNFCCC process, the climate negotiations, how do you think we need to get things moving so that we, humanity, takes our own mortality more seriously?
Well, I come from a very vulnerable country called Bangladesh, which is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. I run a center there called the International Center for Climate Change and Development. We run master's programs for young students. We get international researchers, young researchers coming and studying there. We are already seeing the impacts of climate change in Bangladesh. We have a very low-lying coastal area where salinity is already increasing. So we are very well aware of the problem of climate change, and we are indeed tackling it already. So my desire is to see everybody else tackle the problem with the seriousness that it deserves, and I'm very happy to collaborate with other countries and other people who wish to collaborate in tackling the problem, because it's already on our doorstep, and there is really no argument left for saying that it doesn't exist. I mean, those people are living in flat Earth society land.
Yes, well, there are a lot of people who are living in flat Earth still, unfortunately, and I dare say that economic reasons perhaps keep the blindfolds on. So I think we're almost out of time now. I want to thank you for all of the work you do to make people aware, to make nations move. Again, giving of your time without compensation. And I just am very, very glad that you're here on the scene with us.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. And I want to thank everyone for being with us today. Again, this is Climate Matters. My name's Stuart Scott. We're coming to you live from the UN Climate Talks in Bonn. Here's my email address if you'd like to get in touch. And I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for doing all that you can. And if you would like to get more involved, please, here's an internet address, rebootworld.org, and click on sign up and get added to the list. We'll tell you ways that you can get more involved on very strategic actions. Thank you for attending this live or on the internet.